People. I feel like dry Sift hash generally is going to be more medicinal because you're dealing with cured material, and then the hash itself gets cured. Most hash producing countries typically consume hash that has been cured or has been aged. So if you think about it, at least in my opinion, our endocannabinoid systems should be more adapted to consuming resins that are cured and should be able to absorb that better. Not just that, but you're dealing with material that's dry, so you don't have water content, any residual water content or residual water activity in your resin. And so when you are dabbing or when you are smoking it, you're going to get a smoother hit. You're going to get a lesser amount of more complex terpenes, so you're not going to get as much of the harshness when you smoke. So overall, I prefer dry Sift as far as hash goes, and I feel like it's something that people should check out if it's not something you've tried. Another thing that's really cool about it is that you don't really need the best material to get started. You can pretty much make it out of trim. You can make it out of keef. If your materials, if flour is always great, of course. If it's older, you might not get the best results, but you'll still get something that's workable. If you put some love and care into it, it's always worth trying to bring out the best of the material as much as you can. So today, it's been interesting because I had planned to keep to work with some flour, but that did not go as planned, and so we ended up sourcing some material at the last minute. And so this is a mix of trim and some small buds, and this is pretty much ideal when you're going to be doing dry Sift. It's frankly my favorite to work with because flour involves a lot of work. Breaking down the flour, if your environment is not dialed in right, can be pretty difficult, and you can end up going through a lot of gloves or having to wipe down your gloves many times to keep cleaning this because resin will sometimes come out of that flour, especially if it's flour that's been aged and that's grown to term. The resin's going to be very mature and it's ready to burst if it's not cold enough and if it's not dry enough and if you're not careful enough. On that note, typically dry Sift is done in a more controlled environment. You want to be as dry and as cold as you can typically be. It helps with breakdown of the material and it helps with cleaning up the resin. Yeah, with all that, I guess we'll get started.
So what he's doing, he's putting all the material onto the first screen. What size screen is this?
So this is a 64 lines per inch screen. When it comes to dry Sift, the screens that we use are measured in lines per inch. They're not measured in microns like typical washing type of vessels. We start at what is equivalent to like 244 micron more or less, and that's 86 lines per inch. And the last screen that I have is going to be 196 lines per inch, which comes out to, I think it's like 63 micron. Depending on what you're looking for, you might want to get filter for smaller. Might want to filter something else in between. I filter for a bunch of different things based on what I've learned, and it seems to work really well for me. But I mean, if you're looking for melt or if you're looking for different things, you might want to change the screen setup a little bit. Right, so again, we're starting with an 86, and that's where you break up your keef or your material to create keef. So in this case, because it's trim, there's not too much breaking down that we want to do. The smalls, for the most part, you're going to want to like break them down manually. If your material is really dry, which this is not super dry, you can usually go in with a few fingers and just kind of rub it or break it down. If you have larger nugs, the best way to go is to just kind of have it with your fingers and keep having it until you basically are out of nugs, I guess. Depending on your time frame and depending on the material that you're working, sometimes it's worth doing the keefing in a lot of different stages. For instance, if you're working with flour, I prefer to take large nugs and have them and get the resin that comes from that and set that aside and then run the nugs again and get smaller keef and finer keef each time. Ultimately, the goal doing this is really not to get bulk because it's really easy to get bulk. you're kind of aiming for purity. You want pure resin. So you want to be gentle with the material on the screens, but you do want to be rough enough so that you're breaking it open and you're getting all the resin to fall out of the plant material as much as possible. You do have to be careful. If you're in a colder environment, it's easier to avoid getting resin on your gloves. Once that starts to happen, you're getting lost. So you can either switch gloves or put another pair of gloves on, or if you have the time to do so, and you don't want to waste a bunch of gloves, you can always just sanitize your gloves with alcohol and with some anti-static wipes that don't have what's called anti-lint wipes. Yeah. So yeah, either sanitize your gloves, or you might have to change them out, or change layers every once in a while as you work through material. You're going to keep on chunking. The keep is what I usually do, and keep chunking the bud, the trim. And eventually you end up with powder, or close enough to powder if you have trim, or you end up with chunks of flour if you have flour, and you're ready to move on to the next stage. So I'm going to go ahead and do this for a little bit. It's very clean.
And if you guys want to come up here and check it out what he's doing, because this is kind of a up close kind of visual thing that he's doing. So you guys are more than welcome to bump on up and actually look at what he's doing, because you're not going to be able to even imagine what he's doing right now.
You can come up close. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot. It's totally fine. I'm happy to answer them as we go. Because, I do need a little bit of time to actually process the material. So you'll notice that I'm picking up material and I'm dropping it on the screen. I'm delicately picking it up and trying to not drag it across. And that's important because when you're making your keef, it's very easy to over extract. You can get chunks of pistils and leaves and all kinds of crap. And it's really easy to make your job a lot harder than it needs to be in the later stages. The more careful you are at this point, the better. You guys might also notice that there is some little spacers on my screens. The reason for that is because, and this is honestly smaller than I prefer to go. I prefer to put like full jars if I can. The reason for that is because you want some airflow. Depending on the material that you're working, sometimes there's dust on it. Sometimes small particles of plant matter fall through the first screen. So yeah, it helps to just kind of like have that airflow to help blow things out as it falls through.
Do you use the post-sift plant material for butter or anything?
It depends. So, for instance, sometimes you end up with really, really small nugs like this kind of. And if it's very compressed material or it's not dried enough, it can be really hard to work. So at that point, instead of keep sifting it and breaking it down and just ended up with a really green product, yes, I prefer at that point to extract it into edibles. That's usually what I do if I'm working for myself. I think it's more worth it. You get a really full spec edible if you extract it correctly, and yeah, it's great.
And less moisture too.
Yes. A bunch of stuff that I didn't even get into before I got into this, but environment is really important when you're doing dry sift, but not just environment. Like really, you have to think about everything when you're doing when you're washing. Your primary consideration, right, is like your water, your temperature, and all that good stuff. When you're sifting, you have to be really conscious of everything that you're touching, the materials that you're wearing. Ultimately, you have to be conscious that everything has a charge, including yourself. So anytime that you are interacting with the material, it's not hard to kind of screw things up and to get unwanted things to come into it. I've had situations where it's like I'm working with stuff and I'll have like fuzzy socks or something, and I'll notice the fuzz all of a sudden starts flooding through the screens. Everything is static. Like people talk about static tech when it comes to sifting. Ultimately, like every interaction with material is going to involve static electricity. Every single exchange that we have in life involves that in the end. So when you're touching the material, you have to be careful, you have to be conscious of that. The gloves that I use, the material that the screens are made of, the material that the edges are made of, the clothes that I wear, everything. You have to think about things when you're going into this, because it's very easy to contaminate or to just make it a situation where you're basically a magnet for resin, or something else in the room is a magnet for resin, and you just lose a lot of material, and it's just bad times. All right, so this is mostly extracted, I think.
So what you're saying is that you don't want any clothes that you're going to be wearing that has any kind of lint on it or produces lint. Like the jacket that you're wearing, that jacket's not going to give off any lint.
Yeah, you want to be kind of conscious about stuff like that, but you also want to be conscious about clothes that produce static. So certain types of materials will, you'll notice you'll wear certain kinds of socks, right? And all of a sudden you're shocking yourself or something, right? That kind of stuff has really fun effects when you're sifting. Sometimes you might want that. It depends on what you're trying to do. But generally speaking, you kind of have to be careful with that kind of stuff. Everything affects things.
So the extreme example in that case would be like a dry fit or like a polyester shirt you get from Nike. That would be like a piece of clothing that can generate static, and we might not think of it.
Yeah.
So that would be the example.
Yeah.
So outside of a lint-producing cloth, that would be the example.
Yes, you can deal with stuff like that. And again, sometimes that's desirable. But sometimes if you can't seem to have I've had this happen where sometimes the environment doesn't get dialed in right or whatever, and I can't seem to do static pickups like typical static tech that people do. And so changing things around sometimes help. Take off your shoes, all kinds of shit like that makes a difference. We need somewhere to put this into. Am I good to go?
You are good to go.
All right, once you crunch up your material enough, usually what I do is I just set it aside on another container, a clean container, and leave it to your run again. Usually you're not going to extract all the resin on the first run, and that's okay. It's honestly better if you don't. It's better if you do this in a lot of phases. And you can apply the necessary care to each phase. If you have really fine material, you want to be more careful than if you have a lot of flour chunks and stuff, right? So we're going to keep on working a little bit more of this, kind of like we did before, and just get some nice keep going. Again, just trying to break down the flour as much as possible where there's flour. If it's chunks of trim, try to leave the leaves, just break them down a little bit, but we're not trying to make powder ultimately. If all the powder leaf material falls through the screen, it's a lot more work. So you don't want it to be too fine. Oh shit, I'm doing that.
There you go.
All right, so we've probably worked through enough to have a little bit of keef, and if not, we'll work a little bit more. Does anybody have any questions or anything so far? All right, well.
You mentioned the material at the sides of your screens. Are those stainless steel? Are they aluminum? What are you working with?
They're aluminum.
Aluminum.
Yes, they're aluminum, and the material that the screens themselves are made of, I forget exactly what it is, but the way that it interacts with the resin is that it attracts it, right? So you'll notice that there's a lot of dry sift screens around. Some of them have this yellow mesh. Again, I'm bad with material names. I can't think of what it is right now, but basically it will do the opposite effect. It'll repel the resin. So when you're using on one of those screens, sometimes that's something you want, but generally speaking, in my experience, it's not. Same thing with the frame. The aluminum frame repels the resin and it attracts a lot of crap. Sometimes when you have just crap on the screen, like leaf bits or whatever, you'll just see it naturally attract to the aluminum screen based on whatever charge it's got, and that's fine. It's super helpful. Or you can just brush things close to it and it'll get to it. We'll get to that. But yeah, like depending on the screen that you have, sometimes it doesn't help. I've heard good and bad things about wood screens. It just depends. You have to be really conscious about the materials that you're using and just how they affect like things electrically, I guess. And it's not like you have to be super sure about everything. A lot of it is trial and error. Like I have no idea what these brushes that I use are made of. I just know that I've gone through a bunch of different brands of brushes and these happen to work with me. It's just kind of how it works. And it's not like I can say, oh, buy this brand or buy this specific one, because it changes based on your environment. So if you have a certain level of humidity and a certain level of heat, certain things might work better for you that don't work for me, and vice versa. And that's just kind of how it is. This is really dependent on the person doing it, on the environment, and all kinds of stuff. Of course, you can machine a lot of this process, but I'm going to argue that having a person do it, you end up with a lot better quality. There are some steps that maybe it's not unreasonable to use some additional aid, but you do have to be careful because it's really easy to introduce extra crap into your hash. So you really don't need to. I like how the screen sound on the mic.
I like it also.
Fun stuff, right?
Yeah.
And even that matters. Like, when we're done with this, your microphone's going to be covered in resin. Just letting you know.
It's not my microphone.
Okay, well, whoever it is, it's going to have a bad time getting clean. So just FYI, it's a magnet. And like that's just how this shit goes. Like you have to be really mindful of everything. And even like whenever we start, if we have time to do a static pass, I'm going to ask you to take that away because like all this shit matters. You have to be really conscious of it. Anyway, so.
You're not being gentle with it.
Not quite. It's trim. So picking it up, what matters is being gentle with it on the screen. You don't want to like rub it against the screen too much. It's one thing if you're rubbing your glove as you're picking stuff up, but I don't want to like drag material because what ends up happening is if you drag material through the screens, so two things happen. As you're dragging material through the screens, which ultimately you do want to do with some care, resin falls through the holes, and material that's not resin, which is plant material, will get caught in the holes or fall through. If it gets caught in the holes, when you pass over it again or when it gets bumped again, more likely than not, it's going to break. And once it breaks, that little fleck that broke off is going to fall through, and that's another contaminant. So you have to be conscious of how much you are screwing around with things on the screen. It's really easy to just make your life very difficult later down the line when you're trying to make clean hash. So let's see here. Yeah, that's a good start.
Yeah, guys, if you guys want to go look at it, because it's like, let's be able to see what it looks like.
Yeah, so if you want to go look, this is what we have so far. I'm going to finish crunching up that last bit of flour and just get what we got out of these jars and go from there. I'm not sure what the initial weight is, but we should have checked that. That would have been interesting. Yeah, we'll have a little something for sure. And, you're only seeing what's accumulated on the top screen if we just show that. As the material falls through, because the screens are clean, it falls through all the screens as far as it can flow until it hits some kind of obtrusion. So what you see at the very top is just the keef level. There's already some resin at the bottom of the screens depending on how much this is dumping.
I missed at the beginning. What's your different micron? Do you have different?
So it starts at 244 and it ends at 63. And I'll explain each one as like, yeah, full spec for sure. And honestly, I'm missing the screen. I usually have another screen at 63. It's just helpful. Yeah. Yeah, I think I said this ends at 63. No, it doesn't. It ends at 70. It's 72. That's the lowest screen that I have right now. 63 is my usual. I mean, honestly, yeah. How to put this? Again, we'll get to this in more detail, the lower screen, but basically, the type of contamination that you're dealing with as you're crunching up the material changes, right? So the first few layers of material, you deal with a lot of fun stuff and it's difficult. And then there's that middle point, like the 90U basically, which is just easy peasy and it all comes out whatever. And then you get to the smaller microns, and the smaller microns, depending on what you did up top, you pay for it. So, and even if you did really well, you know, if your material, for instance, if your trichomes had really long stalks, when you get to the bottom layer, you basically have stalk flour. There's just so much dust that's just dusted up stalks, and removing that from the trichomes takes a while, and it's difficult. Yeah. So that's the thing, you know, if the room's not cold enough, which I have no idea what temperature we're in, it's pretty cozy wearing a jacket, that's for sure. Yeah, that'll happen. Especially if we're chunking up flour, if the resin's nice and mature, you know, unfortunately, it's not hard to lose a little bit. But the fact that we're getting some in the gloves is not a terrible sign. It just means that there's some. And of course, you know, if the environment was colder, we wouldn't, but it is what it is. And frankly, like, that's been my experience with dry sift. Like, I haven't really had an ideal environment except for like a couple of times. And that's fine. Like, it's cool to be able to like regulate it and figure out how to roll with it. You don't need, like, having perfection, like anything helps, but you don't really need it to be perfect. A lot of the best work I did, frankly, was in my apartment in the Bay Area. And like, it was just an apartment with no air conditioner and 2 air purifiers and a dehumidifier, and I rocked it as hard as I could. You know, was I at the mercy of day and like having to work from like, I don't know, 3 in the morning to 7 sometimes to just make it work? Yeah, it is what it is. But I mean, I think like anyone can make it work. You just need to get some screens and some dry material and just go nuts.
Please change your car primer.
What's up?
Please change your car primer.
It does, you know, and it's not that expensive to get started. If you like, you know, if you appreciate the medicine that is hash, then it's a great way to go. And that's really actually like my angle with this. Like, it's ultimately it's medicine. You know, you want all the compounds that are in here. When you're washing hash, you know, no matter what you do, there's always stuff that leaches out into the water. So you're losing stuff. And not only are you losing stuff, but the whole process of washing hash, you're introducing so much crap. Like, you know, are your hoses food safe? Are your, what's it called? The joints to your stuff, is it brass or is it stainless steel? What kind of stainless steel? There's a lot of questions if you really think about it. How much are you washing your hash in water, and how much are you washing your hash in a combination of water and a bunch of shit? And all that shit is going to get into your, like, it's going to get concentrated when you freeze dry it, depending on what you're doing. So, I don't know. I mean, it's like, if you can get clean material, if you can age it correctly, cure it correctly, dry it, then, I mean, like, dry sift is just a really good way to not have to fuck around with other stuff. Like, you just get a really nice, clean medicine that's really complete cannabinoid profile. It's great terps, especially if the flower is good. And even if the flower is not that good, the high is always really nice and it's really smooth. So, yeah. And I love this stuff. I'm sorry, I can't help but gush about it. It is what it is. All right, so okay, so we got a little bit of keef at the top screen. If anybody wants to come and look at it up close, feel free. Whatever was in that jar is need to ask.
A couple ounces,
Yeah.
like 2.5 ounces.
It was something for sure.
Wow.
Okay, so after we get through the first layer, the next screen is the 86 screen, which is 170 something. I think it's 176. Yeah, 176U, I think is more or less what it is. So what we do at this point is, this is Keith. I use a brush to move it around. The reason I use a brush is several things. For one, the brush is kind of like a different kind of filter. As it's brushing through the keef or the resin or whatever, because of the way that the bristles are shaped, it's going to allow resin to go through it, and it's going to, if the resin has any trichomes and it hits the right points, the trichomes break off and it cleans the head. If it's a material that is not perfectly round and smooth, like a piece of leaf or whatever, it gets caught in the brush. So like right now, after tapping the brush once, all the resin that was on there falls off, and I can clearly see on it that there's nothing but green flecks. And if you take like a camera phone or a microscope or something and look it up, it's really reliable. You'll notice that the brush is pretty much just picking up crap. So depending on your SOP, there's a few things you can do. If you're really obsessive about not losing a single gram, you can set a bowl apart and you can bang your brush into the bowl and have like a little bowl of shit. Be really careful if you're doing that. This stuff jumps into the air. It'll recontaminate your resin. It sucks to breathe it in. It gets everywhere. So generally speaking, working in a big environment like this where it's open air, it's great for this kind of stuff. Once I see the brush doesn't have anything, I just tap it out. I don't really want this. Ultimately, also, like anything that clings to the brush, because everything is static and everything is affected by the charge that it has. As the brush brushes through the resin, it's going to pick up some things, and sometimes it picks up heads too. Most of the heads that it picks up are not heads that you want to smoke anyway. Most of them are going to be mostly empty. I mean, you can save them, you can spend the time to try to do it, but it's not always worth it. So generally speaking, I'll brush the resin around. I try to look on the screen and see where I can identify areas where it's just junk. As you're brushing the resin around, there's spots where you'll notice that there's just not much going around. And you can just brush it off. Like right here, for instance, I just see like green and black. It's very easy to just move it off to the edge. You can immediately see it. It tracks to the screen too. To the edge too, depending on what it is, and just remove it. It's not worth keeping anything that's dust at this stage or that's bad. It's easy for it to contaminate your resin. Another thing that I like to do sometimes, especially if you're trying to move fast, like today. And at the keef stage is just kind of like shake it around a little bit and try not to get it. Just try to get it to fall through as quickly as it can. So like right now I'm just clearing up green material that looks like mostly junk and trying to not let it so much fall through the screen, but just kind of move it off. I can tell that like right here there's a bunch of resin. So I'm just going to go ahead and brush this off to the open space that I just cleaned up and keep brushing it. And you can see that more plant material falls on screen. And it just gets moved off to the side or brushed off. So the other thing I'm going to do at this stage is I'm going to use a gloved hand to just move the resin around. Whenever you're doing that, you want to be really careful. We're not trying to static the resin at this stage. We're just trying to move it around quickly so we can move through the screens and not be here for hours and hours and hours, because it's not hard to do that. I can't help but get a little bit obsessed sometimes, so yeah, I don't want to go too long. So what I'm doing is just moving around the keef on the screen, vibrating it a little bit, and just kind of feeling through or looking at the material that's on the screen and trying to make a judgment on what's left. The more this happens, the more you can see that there's just green flecks of dust that are clearly nothing, and little bits of resin that were kind of here and there are more and more falling through. Okay, so this is it pretty much. We're going to call it here. So at this point, I removed the 170 screen. This is as far as I want to go with it. There may or may not be some resin there. It's probably not a whole lot. So this is the 125 line print screen that I use.
So the first one, sorry, is basically waste. You're not really going to do much with it.
I would just set that aside, and you can use it, put it into, like, if I'm making edibles for myself,
Edibles or so, okay.
I would dump it into edibles, because there's still going to be cannabinoids. There's good medicine in every part of the plant. So, like, throwing it away is kind of like, why are you doing that? If you can use it, absolutely use it. It's just, you got to be a little bit, yeah. There is also worth mentioning that, like, depending on how it was grown, that catch might have a lot of dust and just general crap that you do not want to eat. So it just depends what you're working with. I don't know where this came from. I don't know how it was grown exactly. I don't know anything about it. So I would kind of be iffy about that particular stuff, because it might just be like, I don't know, like if they use rope or something to tie things around, there might be little fibers. Once you look at it under the scope, you can see that. And if you're careful enough, it'll get caught at that level. But yeah, so this is below the 170 screen. This screen is 119U. So everything that's above here is 119 to 170 or 173. And this is like our first layer of like Sift as opposed to keef, which is really just, it's filtered keef, right? At this point, this looks like there's a good amount of resin. There's other stuff here too. Much like above, I'll go ahead and I'll brush it up.
That's interesting you mentioned dust, because when I started making my RSO, before I started making bubble bags to filter it, I would get a lot of dust in my RSO, and once I started doing that,
Yep. Yeah, just dust it off.
it's so much cleaner. I mean, it wasn't bad. It was just, like you said, less.
No, but it's a quality increase for sure. And if you're being able to make better, cleaner medicine, like it's 100% the way to go. It's always worth the effort in my opinion. All right, so this stage is super fun because there's really nice resin here. It's probably my favorite, honestly. If there's any resin in the 125 screen, it's usually a lot of big heads, and they're going to be really tasty as far as I'm concerned. The only thing that is difficult is this screen also catches a bunch of different types of contaminants. So you're going to have a lot of really small contaminants that are either charged or for some reason want to stay on this screen, and you're going to have big contaminants that just stay on here because that's how big they are, right? So once we clean this up a little bit, which we're going to do by brushing it around gently in this manner, and sometimes you want to move the resin by having the brush up, right? And what these actions do is you're moving things around the screen, and you're cleaning the screen as you're going and making kind of like clean spaces to clean the resin on. And you're just polishing all the trichomes. If you think about it, trichome in the stalk is like a little teardrop shape. As it rolls through the screen, it loses the trichome bit and it falls through, and you end up with just the clean heads at the top, or that's the theory. Or the head or whatever's like trash belongs on that screen, and then we'll have to separate that, right? So I'm going to go ahead and keep on brushing this for a bit. Generally, I don't want to be too aggressive with this, and I'll have to do a second pass on whatever's on this screen to really clean it up. Because if you're too aggressive with cleaning this, then all of that really small, hard to clean stuff goes onto the lower levels, and cleaning that, even from the lower levels, is just not fun. So overall, like when it comes to Sift, like you're always wanting to put work, to make the work ahead of yourself instead of at the time. So, you know, you want to make sure that your environment's clean, you want to make sure your clothes are clean, you want to make sure everything's dialed in. When you're sifting, you don't want to over extract, because anytime that you do, you're going to pay for it. It's going to be more work later on. And sometimes it's not easy to remediate the issues, depending on what it is. So there's definitely some resin on this level that we're going to have to come back to clean. There's not a whole lot, but there's definitely something. So at this point, I would usually just stop on this screen and move on to the next and see whatever we got, right? So we're going to go ahead and move this off to the side. Yep. Yep. So like at that stage, what the best thing to do is for that micron is just keep cleaning the rest, and once we're done with it, separate everything and then go back to it. Yep.
So you had mentioned missing a screen, and this is something that like well, so there are some brands that I've noticed that they just sell like sets of screens, and they sell them in the same sizes that you would see for a washing set. Now, there's a huge advantage to what you're doing, setting the screen off to the side here that's not intuitive, which is going back onto it. So if those people who are selling sets of 5 screens maybe sold 2 of the 70U screens, or I guess the 200 line, whatever the line prints that goes up to 70, then you would be able to take something like that and you'd be able to work it all over your 90U screen and then brush it up and sweep it on top of a clean 90U screen and repeat the process over and over. So having 2 screens at the same level is actually a huge advantage if you can piecemeal your material. Not every brand is going to do that.
That's pretty much like what the refinement process is. Like once they're like, depending on how far you want to take this, right? I personally try to take it until the resin is as pure as I can get it. So usually what I will do is I work through all the screens and isolate the resin as best I can. So you'll end up with little piles kind of like this, or big piles depending on how much material you are working, right? And so once you have that isolated resin, you separate it and you go through all your screens and you clean them all spotless. And after they're spotlessly cleaned, you go again and you brush it all again and you start staticking and you start doing all that other stuff to get it. There's a bunch of things you can do really to clean it up, but that's the point. Like, as you're working through it, the screens are a great tool because they pick up all the junk as you're working through them. But they pick up all the junk that stays there. So you do have to go back, depending on what you're working, and clean off the screen or pick up the material and clean off the screen and then keep going at it or come back to it or what have you.
Yeah, like your smallest one being at 60 or 70 that's a good idea. A lot of the sets, they have them as small as like 25, which is basically a tabletop in terms of sets. So it's like,
yeah, I mean, I don't know if you 25 micron or 25. Yeah, I mean, you can again if you're working with a cultivar that you know has resin that's small, then yeah, like totally get that screen. I've not worked anything. Well, no, I'm lying. There was the one thing. I've only worked one strain that had really, really, really small heads. That it went through every single screen I had, even the one that I don't have today. And like at the bottom of it, I could still see a bunch of heads, but with all the shit that came through from the whole wash. I mean, from the whole sift. So yeah, like there may be cases where you want that 25U or a 30-something screen. It's just not. Yeah, it's going to be strain dependent. It depends on how much you're trying to get out of it too. You know, what you're working with, all that good stuff. So, yeah. So we're going to finish brushing the resin through if there's any resin at this level. It doesn't look like there's a whole lot. Or if there is, it's mostly not a whole lot. It's going to be stuck to the screen, so we'll have to pull it off in a bit. And it happens sometimes. Sometimes you get some trim and it looks kind of shiny and you think it's good, and it's not. Sometimes it is. It just depends. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next screen. Let's brush through. There's still a little bit more material. And generally speaking, depending on what you're working, I mean, yeah, generally speaking, as you're working through stuff, every screen is going to have a little bit less and a little bit less and a little bit less. until it's like the micron that you're supposed to be at, or you're done. So right now, this is the 158 screen. This is what is it? This is 103U, if I'm not mistaken. So this we're dealing with between 103 and 119. Usually, when you get to the screen, most of the plant material has already been filtered out. Most of it should reside on the 125, depending on how you did things. Did I even? Yeah, I didn't go over it, but we also had another screen above this one. It didn't really catch much of anything. So, yeah, we're going to keep on going through this. This seems like it got most of what we're going to get. Probably is clean resin. So,
Yeah, no doubt.
all right, so this might have been all the resin we got out of this trim. This is, oh, actually, no, there might be a little bit more. All right, let's see. This is a 2 screen. So this is from 80 to 93 is the last screen. This might just be stocks and bits from the last stuff. Yep, looks like we're done. Okay, so there wasn't a whole lot of resin out of this, unfortunately. I was hoping we'd be able to process some flour to get a little bit more material, but we can talk about what we would have done if there was more to work with. And we can kind of finish cleaning up the 125 as well. So usually, depending on your output, right, you continue working your material a couple of times. After you, like we were talking earlier, after you go through the resin, if you have enough to clean up, then you might want to take that and separate it from your screens, clean your screens up, and go ahead and run it a second time, brush it up. Anything that comes out of the brush, you go ahead and throw it away, and you can go ahead and keep on doing that until you get cleaner resin, right? So we're going to go ahead and we're going to take all the resin from the 125 screen, and we're going to put it on the smallest micron screen. And so what that's going to let us do, it's going to let us clean it up, because we didn't really catch anything down here. It's just dust.
I've been doing this on top of the setting. Oh my goodness. And that's why I was like, man, I wish they just sent me to the settings. Every time I get down to my settings screen, I'm like, this is what money's at. I just never thought to do it to the settings 25.
Okay, so we got our large resin on this small screen. The reason that we do that is because there is a lot of small, really, really tiny black contaminants that are really annoying and they're hard to get out. this is a good way to deal with that. Putting your resin of a higher grade or of a higher size on a smaller size string. It helps catch things, it helps remove them. So what you generally want to do is you want to spread your resin thin, and you want to go ahead and just catch whatever you can that's black and separate it, or catch anything you can that's green, that's obviously not resin, and kind of separate it out. The other thing that's really fun that's happening right now is you might notice, if you're looking up close, that there's like bands kind of happening in the resin, or like it keeps getting stuck to the screen. So this is one of the joys of working Sift. Sometimes when you don't know the materials that you're working with, you can sometimes experience fun things like this. So I'm not exactly sure if it's because of the humidity here, or if it's because of the wood that's sitting on, or it's just, you know, I don't know, I've brushed the screen too much. It can be any number of things.
Some type of static charge.
Yes, static charge starts to accumulate and it starts to fuck around with things. So
At this point, if too much static charge is in there, could you just kind of walk away,
Yes.
cover it up, and let it dissipate down?
yes, you can always do that. It's always a good idea to not rush things. So there's always going to be pressures to get things done sooner, but frankly, it's always best whenever things get weird, just walk away and come back to it later. You'll let the charges dissipate. Sometimes it's you, sometimes it's the environment. You might want to look at what your settings are, and then once that happens, you can kind of make a call from there and just kind of try to dial it in. Sometimes it just doesn't happen, and you just kind of have to fight it. It can be so many different things. Like right now, as I'm trying to think of what to blame, right? Typically, when I work on this on my own, I will work with a table that changes height. And the reason for that is because the electrical fields that come out of your body start at about, are at their strongest at about this level, at about crotch level, more or less, as far as I know at least. So when you're working with the resin and you're arched over looking at it, it's easy to kind of create an environment where you have too much stuff going on. Again, it depends on what your environment is like and how to adjust to it. Working in a new place presents fun challenges like this sometimes. It kind of is what it is. So what we're going to do is... what's that?
That makes a ton of sense, because I'm just thinking about the last time that I changed setups, and I was even using the same table, but it was slightly different, just the way it was set up in terms of height, and I was just like, yeah, every time I've changed the setup, I'm just like, where did all my weed go? And it's just like,
yep. Every time you change anything in your environment, any variable for this, it matters. Anything. You didn't have breakfast that day, some asshole came in and told you off halfway through the sifting, like, anything that fucks with you is going to make a difference. It's absolutely crazy. It's very delicate, but the end process, in my opinion, is always worth it. You get really good medicine, and you can sometimes make material shine that's been trashed, that's been sitting in a jar for years and nobody's giving a shit about it. And you run it through the screens and there's great resin. It's just, you just need to give it some love. And you need to give it a space, and you need to dedicate yourself to just getting that out of there. It can take some time, and it can take a lot of work, but it's 1,000% worth it. I don't know if Joshua Cannabis Fine has any of the Sift that we worked on in the last few weeks, but I mean, all of that was kind of like that. It's a lot of work that goes into it. There's not always a huge return depending on the material that you're using, depending on how old it was, depending on when it was harvested, on how it was treated. There's a lot of variables, but you do get really good medicine out of it. And like just in terms of like the high, the flavor, everything, I think it's great. So what I'm going to do is I'm putting another set of gloves on. And we're going to do a static clean on this and on that, kind of like the way that most people typically do a static tech, which is just with a glove. The reason for that is because I don't want to take too much time, and we don't have a whole lot of material. So if we can pick up some of it, it would be cool to kind of see it, and we can get that. It's only going to be a little tiny bit, unfortunately, but we can kind of show that. Anytime you're putting gloves on the resin, generally speaking, you want to make sure that you sanitize your glove, clean it. You don't know what's going to be on that most of the time. Or actually, you don't know what's going to be on that, period. So, anytime you're touching your screens, ISO your glove, wipe it clean, make sure there's no crap on it, even if it's a new glove, every single time. or if you're not into isopropyl for whatever reason, just have your alcohol and some wipes. All right, so once that looks clean enough, right, so if you're doing static passes, whether you're doing them with a glove or whether you're doing them with a DVD with a parchment paper, or you're doing a paint roller with a glove, or you're doing whatever you're doing like this, there's a few things to be mindful of. You generally want to do this in a colder environment, so this might not work, and this might just make a mess of things, or southern dry. You also want to limit the number of times that you do this. I typically only will do static after I'm done cleaning a batch. I feel like the more you do it, it's not hard to degrade your material. You're basically applying energy to it with every pass. And it's a lot more aggressive than what you do when you're doing it with a brush. When you're using the brush, you're applying, it picks up static. Generally, it picks up junk. You're not applying that to the resin so much. When you're using your hand, you're using a lot of friction to generate static electricity, and you're picking up stuff, and you're rubbing it against the screens, and that helps refine it. But it can also cause problems. Sometimes you can lose your resin to your screens, or you can lose the resin to your gloves, depending on what your environment is like as you're going through it, right? So we're going to go ahead and try that with the 158 screen first, and then we'll try this one, and we'll see if we get anything out of it that's a little bit cleaner, and see what that looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and move this off.
This is like that in the candy video where they chop up the candy. This is like the super satisfying part to watch.
I don't know. I think I feel some kind of way about this personally. Like,
I do too. It's extremely high pressure, but it's satisfying to watch.
Oh no, not in that sense. It's just, again, it's not something that I think is. If you're doing a really good job and you have a really good dialed in environment and you are being careful enough, you should not need to do a static pass. If you're doing a static pass, it's generally because something went wrong, or because you really need to clean it out and it's just dirty and you just can't get it out any other way. You should avoid it, frankly. If you can just use mechanical, the brushes on the screens over and over again, it might take forever. But if you keep doing that, I feel like the resin that you get is a higher quality. If you rub it too much, it's not hard to heat it up and to start degrading things.
Get that.
Yeah. And I mean, all these things, actually, we're going to move this off to the side. I don't know if you guys can hear me, but yeah, like, when you're doing static, like, all these things matter. So like having a microphone that has a magnetic field, and I don't know how far the magnetic field gets before it starts affecting things.
Right.
I used to have my press next to my screens. And like, actually, I left my press next to my screens because guess what? The press is a magnet for, not the press, but the pump on the press. If I just pumped it a little bit, just from the fluid going through, that would generate a current. And that current was conveniently attracting all kinds of junk. So it was very nice to have it next to my screens. That's not always going to be the case. Sometimes you're going to pull resin. Sometimes it's just going to fuck with your fields and you're just not going to be able to get things working right. So again, these are things that you have to be careful with. It's not always going to work depending on how well or not your environment's dialed in. You want to make sure everything is really clean. If there's anything, when you're generating that static on the screens, like, there's just so much that comes into play. It's just never worth doing for the most part. Like, after you static charge the resin, for one, after you need that resin into a container, that container is not, that the resin in that container is charged. So that's a magnet for all the stuff that's around you in the air. If there's any fuzz, any dust, anything, the moment you've done that, it is ready to get contaminated. And you've put a lot of work into it to get to that stage. And you will notice that contamination, and it sucks. So yeah, like it's something that generally speaking you want to leave either till the very, very, very end, or make sure that you have a pristine environment when you're doing it. Generally, again, like that's just how I feel about it. That's just been my experience. You know, I see people staticking right off the bat, and I mean, you know, if it works for them, I guess it works for them. But in my experience, anytime you're doing that, you're creating problems. Heck, if it's not clean enough, you do a static run, and you end up bursting a couple heads. And what you end up bursting falls on plant material or falls on other junk, and that resin is going to seep into it. And now that paste is going to charge exactly like the resin charged. So when you start staticking, it's going to behave like everyone else. And because it's shaped oddly, it starts to break, and you end up forming little temple balls on your fingertips, and it's just bad times. You just lose everything, or you lose a lot. So, yeah, it's not ideal. I get that there's a market appeal, and people talk about being able to just do that like at scale or something. My experience kind of says different. I feel like doing things more mechanically with a brush and with the screens works better. You can't overdo it either. If you have metal screens, for instance, I've seen people do that. You chop up the material a lot accidentally just by bouncing it around. You can't, you know, vibrate the screens too much, because if you're too violent with it, the same thing happens. You're dusting through things that you shouldn't dust through, and you're creating more work. So you just have to be mindful of these things. Anyway, so all that said, we're gonna give this a shot, see what happens. Who knows? If you guys want to look at it before it disappears, feel free. It's just a little tiny bit of resin. It may go away. But generally speaking, when you're done, or when you're getting to a static point, you want to see something that looks kind of like that. You can tell that it's relatively clean if you look at it and you look at the... I mean, it's really not super clean, but it's clean, as clean as we can get at this point, because it's a small amount. But if you look at it, you can look at the shape of the light, kind of, and you can see like little round shapes. Once you start seeing round shapes in your sift, it means it's pretty clean. You have a lot of heads. You can start staticking, or you can brush it if you have the patience and the time. Ideally, you can keep brushing it and get as clean as you can and call it a day. That's really the best. But if you want to static it, at this point, usually what I'll do is there's a few different things you can do, really, right? Some folks will do, you can take a DVD and you can wrap a piece of parchment on it, and then you can pass it through the screen. You can do the same thing with a glove, with a nitrile glove specifically, as thick as you can get it. That helps, and you just pass it through the screen in one direction. What that does is you're creating like a polarized charge. You'll notice that you have kind of like a negative side and a more positive side, and that one side is going to attract the heads, and the other side is going to attract stuff that you don't want. So after you're done doing that static pass, you want to look at your hand, or you want to look at your tool, or whatever you were using, and you want to see what you picked up. And if you don't see heads on one side and you see crap on the other side, or if you just see crap on both sides, that means your material is not ready to be static, and you need to stop what you're doing and you need to keep cleaning. If you do see that division between the two, that's a great point to go. You want to do static to kind of save time, knock yourself out. It's a good time to do it. Again, one single direction, a few passes, 2, 3, and check. And you should see 2 lines going on. That's one way to do it. You can do it again with your hand, with a DVD, with a paint roller. You can also do what a lot of folks do, which is with a really well-fitting glove, you will rub around the screen gently, but not too gently. And you want to make sure you're kind of picking stuff up. You can kind of feel it with your hands. We don't have a mountain of resin today. It's unfortunate. Look, we got some stuff. We don't have a mountain of resin, but when you have a lot of resin and you go into it with your hands, it always feels cold. So you know that you're in for a good time if you feel that cold. And you keep rubbing it, and you keep rubbing it, and you keep rubbing it. And as you keep rubbing it, you can feel the thickness of the material that accumulates. And this is actually not bad for little, I mean, for what we have going on. It's a decent enough static pickup to see, right? When you pick up with your gloves like this, there's a pattern that forms. Usually, you get resin that picks up alongside your fingers in this manner. You get resin in the tips. You get a ring around your thumb. You get kind of a shape here. Not everything is what it looks like. It's not all resin. all the stuff on your fingertips, 9 out of 10 times it's crap. It looks real pretty. You're going to be tempted to put it in with your bowl. You're just wasting everybody's time by doing that. Like, you don't want to do it. It's just duff. What you want to do is, and I didn't think this through enough. We should have gotten something to dump this into. But
I was going to ask you, like, where do you put your reed?
yeah, usually you would have. I'm not used to presenting like this, so this is all very new to me. Please excuse me. Usually, I would have a very clean, separate container from everything else. I prefer to use parchment. Thank you.
So you dump it on a parchment?
Yes, I dump it into parchment sitting on a metal tray.
Okay.
And frankly, if you can get an aluminum tray, like a roasting tray, and just use that is the absolute best. It just works really well. They're stackable, so you can put enough resin into them without putting too much. You don't ever want to have more than an inch of resin on like whatever you're putting in, because if you have more than that, it starts to cake and it's just bad times, right? Anyway, so let's pretend that this is clean and then we had a bunch more resin. So at this point, what I would do is I would take a brush, either this one or a smaller brush, and gently brush the resin off. But you only want to brush the stuff that's resin. So again, I would avoid the tips of your fingers, just the sides, because the tips are going to have a lot of contamination. Usually that ring around your thumb, you can look at it. Most of the time it's going to be resin. The stuff that's on here, on this side, like kind of like on the edge of the hand, on the edge of the thumb, usually that's going to be resin. Anything that accumulates on the palm, if you have a lot of pickup on your palm and it looks really thick, that's not good. That means you have a lot of contaminants. So you need to put that back. And it's fine. So like in this case, there's some stuff on my fingertips that I don't want. So what I would just do is I would just brush it back into the screen with everything else. Maybe brush a little bit again, depending on how much time or whatever the heck I'm doing. And after I'm done brushing it up again, I would go back and I would make sure my glove looks clean, brush it off. Or if I have wipes, wipe it clean, get it dry. And once it's ready to go, ideally, you would go ahead and go again. So we're going to go ahead and do it again. I'm going to do a heavier static pass this time and just pick up the rest of it.
What are the types of things you look for to change gloves?
Any?
Because I feel like I'm burning through gloves when I do this.
Yeah, you burn through gloves. It's crazy. Your options are you burn through gloves or you're cleaning your glove every single time. Honestly, if you're doing this right, the right way to do it is you change gloves every single time you touch the screens, or you sanitize your glove every single time. We don't have the time to do that today, so it's kind of like do as I say, not as I do, or whatever.
Right.
But that's the way to do it. If you're doing anything else, you are just going to be fucking things up. If you use the same glove again, the residue that's left on is going to do things. So actually, you can see it right now. I just used the same glove twice and I didn't sanitize it. And you can see on my index finger right there, there's a little ball. That little ball is there because there was a little tiny bit of resin that I didn't see, just kind of smeared on there.
Even if it was only one head that busts open.
Even if it was one head that busts open. And then the second you put it on the screen, that resin is going to smear all over the screen. It changes the charge of the material wherever it smears. It changes the charge of anything that it touches. And, it's fun times. So it really pays to be very, very, very careful. Otherwise, you end up losing your material as you're doing things.
One more glove or having to get new material.
Yep.
And it's honestly, it's you pay $120 for a 2-gram jar over there, but you pay $7 for a box of new gloves or wherever you're getting the gloves. You know what I mean?
Yep, for sure.
It's worth the $7.
It always is. You're in my opinion, again, you're making medicine. You want it to be as clean as it can be. Sometimes you're not just removing stock. Sometimes you're removing dust. You're removing bits of hair. You're removing all kinds of crap. Depending on who grew it and where it was, who knows what's on it, right? You want it to be as clean as you can possibly get. So, again, we'll get our pickup. It's not a whole lot, and we'll go ahead and we'll brush it off. And I try again just to brush off the stuff that to me looks like resin. If I see anything that looks kind of thicker, I just don't keep it. And you can look at the the tips here, it looks nice. It's shiny. You can see things that kind of look like heads, and there's definitely heads there. But it's more worth your time to just brush it off and clean it up a little bit again. And after you clean it again, just go again. Ultimately, like, you always need to be trying to get as clean as you can.
That makes a huge difference because I've skipped the step with the tips that you're talking about, and it peppers your stuff up. And
Yeah.
like,
Yep. And I mean, there's a lot of other stuff you can do. Like you're right. If you don't do that, it peppers your stuff up, and you need. It's really funny when you're doing this because sometimes you're picking up and you're like, oh, there's one little speck of green. It'll be fine. I'll just keep going. That little speck of green is going to turn your hash neon. Like, it's crazy. You see a couple of, like, it looks like rice to me most of the time when I see a little, like, the stalks of trichomes. You see them lying around and you're like, oh, it'll be fine. You know, I'll press it out. It's never fine. Anytime you're concentrating and you're pressing it, you're going to end up with a bunch of crap. And it's always worth it to take the time to really clean it out, keep brushing it, or keep doing whatever you're doing and get it off of there. That's pretty much it. Unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of material. My plan was initially that if we had the pound of flour that I was hoping to have here to process, that we'd have enough to make some hash wraps, but we don't. So, sometimes it may be that way. It is what it is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have one more question for you.
Shoot.
So if you look up the videos from like 8 years ago on this, the dude who was doing the static tank, he was going outside and was putting his hands like in like ice packs or in coolers and shit like that, and getting his hands really cold. I've tried it cold hand, I've tried it regular hand, I've tried 3 gloves,
I
I've
tried
tried
putting an ice pack in between my gloves and putting another layer on there.
Right, I get my hand ice cold with a shit glove on, and then I put my good glove on top of that. Like,
Honestly, you want the best thing you can do. And I mean, people like,
no, I've done 3 gloves, dude.
No.
Okay, did I not tell you about that on the way over here? I was like, bro, the people who swear.